Retro Synth Video Program.
Hello, and welcome to Retro Synth Video Program Part 3, sponsored by Yamaha Synthesizers. I'm your host, Scott Brackett, and I'm here to show you some more of these wonderful, old, and weird machines. Let's get into it. So, here we are, Part 3 of the Retro Synth Video Program. In Part 1, I did a brief introduction and history of the machines, and in Part 2, I showed you what it's like to actually use them. And here in Part 3, I'll do some more demonstrations and hopefully show you how these machines might be relevant to today's creative process. One of the ways I was hoping to do that was to talk about some of the storage upgrades that I was going to do to bring the C1 up into the current century. But unfortunately, I was unable to get any of the USB emulator drives to work on it. And at this point, both of the C1s in my possession are exhibiting issues with their capacitors being dried out. So pending a recap, I won't be able to try any more of those upgrades for a little bit. So stay tuned, and I'll hopefully be posting some more videos very soon about my grand success with said storage upgrades. The other way I was hoping to show how these machines are still relevant to today is a little more conceptual and has to do with playing and studying old gear and then taking the lessons learned back to your modern instruments, back to your modern workflow. Sometimes that's learning about a new way of thinking about programming a synthesizer, and sometimes that's just being thankful that things have come as far as they have at this point. Typically, there are features that you'll find on older gear that you don't find on newer synths. Usually there's a really good reason for that, but sometimes you'll find something and think, wow, that's a really cool way to do that. I never would have thought to do that, or that's an interesting way to label that terminology. That's not how we refer to it anymore. The CX5m, for example, allows you to split your keyboard between the sound that you're editing, so you can play the sound as it is now when you do the split. On the other side of the split point, it will reflect any future changes that you make to the patch. Typically, this is handled in modern Yamaha synthesizers by an audition button, or you click the edit button and it'll audition the sound as it was when you first pulled it up, and you can toggle between that and any edits you've made. But it's pretty interesting to be able to have the two on either side of a keyboard split. And I realized you can actually do the same thing with the ModX just by loading up a performance and then making a copy of it and splitting the keyboard. And then as you make tweaks to the version on the side of the split that you've dedicated to that, you can go back and forth and sort of hear your control group, as it were, which is kind of cool. With the ModX, you could actually split it multiple times and do like a gradient of keyboard patches. So, this might not be earth-shattering or anything, but there might be some sound design task in the future that will be easier now that I have this tool in my belt, this sort of mental model. Regardless of whether or not this exact example is very applicable to you, note that it's a good example of looking at the design properties of some synthesizer or gear and applying that same way of thinking to a more modern device. And that's one of the biggest lessons that I've taken away from working with this older gear. So thanks to Yamaha for entrusting these machines to me and sponsoring this video. Let's get started. I thought about it some, and I realized I was a little hard on the CX5m in my last video, while being very congratulatory of the C1's abilities. Some of that is because I don't have access to the full range of software for the CX5m, and some of that is because the C1 reminds me of the computers I grew up with. But regardless, I thought it might be good for me to spend a little more time demonstrating what's right about the CX5m in this video, and try to make up for it a little bit. So first, let's demonstrate what it's like to make a patch on the CX5m, and just to sort of give us a little baseline, I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison of what that same patch would be like to create on a ModX. This is probably not going to end up being the most favorable comparison, given that the ModX is the latest and greatest, but I'll endeavor to get some sounds that I like with the CX5m after that, using the help of an external sequencer in the form of the QY100. So, for the patch creation demo, I'm going to start simple and make a pad sound that's two operators, one carrier and one modulator, with a little bit of pitch modulation via the master LFO on both of the operators to give the patch a little bit of movement. Okay, so let's get into programming the CX5m and ModX side by side. I've got the ModX controlling the CX5m via MIDI, and I've got the ModX also playing its own internal synth engine. Right now you're not going to hear much of a difference, so this is the CX5m. Okay, and here's the ModX internal engine. Maybe just a hair cleaner, but the character is pretty darn similar. So let's start with the CX5m. So right now all I've got is operator 4 active, and if I hit Control and 1, I can turn on operator 1, which is a single modulator that has this little line around here, means that it will feed back into itself. Right now the feedback, which is FB, is set to 0. And I'll get into some of this other stuff here in just a second. But right now we've got operator 1 and operator 4 active. First order of business though, let me show you how to turn off the beeping sound. So let me do Control and Z, and much better. Okay, so let's go ahead, and we've got operator 4 is our main carrier wave, and operator 1 is our modulator. Let's see here. So right now I've got the attack turned way down, which means it's going to come in slow. I think these have a value of between 31, 0 and 31, yeah. So let's go ahead and do 15. There we go. That's the stuff. And maybe let's turn the operator down to about half of what it is. Too much. Okay. Okay, let's do even a little bit more than that. So that's the CX5m sort of starter patch. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of pitch modulation, like I said. So this is kind of the master LFO send area in the upper left here. And then over here, we can apply that amount. And I'm going to set the waveform to 2, which is triangle. And I think I have to hit 1 to turn the LFO on as well. And speed, let's do, I think it's 0 to 255. Yeah, so let's do 129. And I don't hear it, so maybe you crank up the pitch mod. Okay, sounds like it's in there. Maybe I just didn't give it enough in the master area. Looks like it's 0 to 7 for pitch mod, and 0 to 3 for amplitude. There we go. That's the stuff. So let's turn that speed down. And we've made a kitten. Pretty good. Alright, I'm going to turn the amount down even a little more. And speed up, I guess. There we go. Maybe a little less pitch mod. Okay, so that's the CX5m. Certainly is a sound. Actually, let's go ahead and roll that attack off on the modulator a little bit. So that's 15. I think I need to go to a lower number in order to make it slower. There you go. And you can kind of hear there's like a little bit of like crackly noise stuff in the voice chips. I don't know how that's going to come through once the video compression kicks in with YouTube, but that's one of the only differences I'm hearing, or the most obvious difference I'm hearing. So I'm going to switch my camera angle so that you can see what I'm doing on the ModX, and let's get the same patch dialed up here. So this is our reference patch. And that sound is coming from the CX5m itself. Let's go ahead and do the other patch. This is the ModX. So on the CX5m, we had operator 1 modulating operator 4. In this case, I'm going to use operator 1 modulating operator 2 with all these others turned off. But it's the same idea, even if the numbering is different. Let's go ahead and go to operator 1 and do a level. In this case, operator 2 is our main sound source, so I'm going to turn it up and turn operator 1 down. Good, we got our sine, just regular old sine wave. So in order to do sort of what we did with the other, we're going to turn up the level of operator 1. Okay, and now we're going to roll back the attack a little bit. I think that's about the same. Let's go back to part 1 and check. Okay. All right, so now let's get that wacky modulation going. So I'm going to go to the LFO, and I'm going to turn on the pitch modulation master. Okay. So it sounds like I need to turn up the operator a little more. All right, let's check part 1. Yeah, it's got a little bit of a different character. I don't know that I prefer one over the other, but it's interesting to note. Let's set the release a little bit longer. And go back to part 1. Yeah, so as you can see, it was pretty quick to put it together on the ModX, and all of the controls are labeled with complete words instead of abbreviations that you'll find on a device like the CX5m, which has a very limited character width on its display. But as you can hear, you know, there is a subtle difference in the tone. That's the ModX. And that's the CX5m. Some of that is because I don't have them tuned in exactly correctly, but I think there is also some just sort of subtle difference with the way that these two engines work. So overall, they just have different characters that might fit in better in some mixes. You know, the CX5m has a little bit of a breathier tone with that noise. And that might fit in really good with some other track, particularly some kind of synthwave thing. Whereas the ModX has something of a cleaner sound, oddly not as sharp as the part 1. Now some of that is just because I don't have the parameters exactly locked in, and some of it is the differences in the synth engines. But that's just to sort of give you an idea of what it's like to use these synthesizers. I hope you found that side-by-side sort of instructive in some way. So I said I was going to try to highlight what's right about the CX5m, and based on the comparison you just saw, I think we can all agree that it's not ease of use necessarily. The thing that's right about the CX5m is that it offers a different experience that you can get from using current hardware. It runs an obsolete operating system, and because of the limited character width of the display, it has a lot of cryptic abbreviations for things that you need to look up and memorize from the manual. Depending on my mood on any given day, that might be just what I'm looking for, or that might sound like a tedious nightmare. But using it is certainly an experience. But it's not just about the experience. There's also the actual sounds to consider. There are subtle differences in the way that these chips generate sounds, which offer a different texture from later generations of Yamaha synths. So in order to show that off, I'm going to enlist the help of my friend and loyal confidant, the QY100. Certainly not the latest, but in my opinion, one of the greatest portable hardware sequencers ever made. So let's make some retro sounds with the CX5M, and I'll let you decide for yourself how you feel about it. I'm going to start off using the step sequencer, and thereafter I'm going to do some overdubs on top of it. And just to be clear, everything you're hearing here is the CX5M operating in multi-timbral mode. So I've got 4 different presets that I'm playing, and each gets 2 voice per preset. And the QI100 is just triggering each on its own dedicated MIDI channel. Those sweet Sega Genesis sounds. Pull that down a little bit. There we go. And we'll try out some different rhythm options here. So what did we learn? I found a couple of things jumped out at me during my time with these machines, and I think I can summarize them in 3 different axioms. So here they are in no particular order. Number 1, change up your process every now and then to help you avoid creative ruts. While working with the C1 in particular, I realized something, which is that I typically attribute my frustration working with DAWs on a computer with the fact that I'm working on a computer. But truly, I think a lot of the times I'm frustrated with the mouse itself, or having to use the cursor to turn knobs. Compared to having full-on knobs or even keyboard shortcuts, it's like trying to run a marathon while breathing through a straw. It's just very fiddly. So the really cool thing about working with some of these old machines is that they were designed to work under the assumption that a mouse was actually an optional peripheral. So experimenting with that firsthand has really helped me to see that, you know, I could probably improve my experience with a digital audio workstation or a modern recording software by spending more time memorizing and practicing keyboard shortcuts, maybe even setting up some of my own. So without spending any money, I could improve my efficiency by learning the shortcuts for the most commonly used functions in my DAW. It could speed up my workflow and do editing and navigation in some cases without even looking at the screen, which is one of my favorite things about hardware buttons. Something else I really enjoyed was just getting out of my normal workflow, stepping out of the piano roll or grid, having some kind of visual or conceptual representation of the Western scale and the MIDI specifications that serve that scale are necessary, but those representations are, they're abstractions. They're the map. They're not the territory. So using different types of sequencing interfaces is kind of like checking your understanding of the planet with different maps. Maybe this app is more accurate for topography, or this map has better population metrics. Some maps might be less suited to navigation, but they help you understand the scale of the planet in a different way. I guess what I'm saying is that it's important to remember that music is more than just a piano roll. It's more than just a grid. Lesson 2. Set things up so that you spend most of your time doing the funnest part of the process. Something else that was really enforced for me was that when deciding on your workflow, you should set your studio up and set your tool chain up so that you are spending as much time as possible doing the things you want to be doing, and spend your time experimenting in the areas that are fun for you. You can make improvements with everything you already have in your possession just by setting them up differently and doing your process differently. But being mindful of this will help you make better purchases in the future as well. Personally, I love doing my tracking on digital recorders like the Yamaha A16G. Machines like this offer many advantages that you find in a modern DAW, undo, copy, paste, that kind of thing. But the streamlined interface and physical buttons mean that their workflow is really pared down and very quick, and I find inspiring to work with. So when I work with these kinds of devices, I find I'm making decisions based on what my ears perceive as musical. I can't see waveforms, so I can't tell that the kick drum is a little bit ahead unless I can hear it. So if there's something about it that isn't jumping out at me sonically, then I don't know that the things aren't quote-unquote right. When I can see the waveforms or the little MIDI notes out on a grid, sometimes I'm tempted to dive in and start editing and, scooting and making everything perfect. So now, instead of making music, I'm scooting waveforms around, and it can be really easy to sort of squeeze all the humanity and the life out of a composition that way. When I use a multi-track recorder or a hardware sequencer, I find that if something doesn't sound right, I typically just re-record the take. Punch in a section or, erase the whole thing. But what I find is that I'm spending my time actually trying to record parts rather than editing notes and stuff, which to me feels more creative. So that's just my personal preference, and I'm not saying that method is better than any other. I'm just saying that when I work in this way and I'm making mistakes, I'm still having a lot of fun. On the other hand, when I goof up while I'm comping together tons of different takes to try to make one Franken take, or scooting MIDI notes and waveforms around a timeline with a mouse, I tend to get grumpy when I'm making mistakes. Which brings me to lesson number 3. Make the least fun parts of your process as easy, automated, and efficient as possible. This is kind of just the inverse of lesson 2, I know, but it's very important, so I think it bears explicit definition. If possible, it's great to partner up with or hire someone who likes the stuff that you don't like, mixing, mastering, whatever it is, but you can't always do that. And to some extent, there's always going to be some part of the process that you like less than other parts of the process. Like for me, mixing and mastering is often not my favorite part. So I'm still finding a way to sort of make that more and more of a thing that I enjoy. I'm not quite there yet. So in the meantime, what I do is I tend to do all my recording on digital trackers, like I mentioned before, and then I do my mixing in a digital audio workstation because it's super efficient. I prefer to use a computer for that step because setting up panning, moving around sections, and naming files is extremely efficient in a DAW environment. So I don't find that particularly inspiring, but since I don't like that part of the process that much anyways, the best thing for me is just to make it as easy and efficient as possible. So I hope you enjoyed this tour of the music computers of yesteryear. Maybe I can answer one final question, which is, are retro synths better than new synths? Yeah, no, sort of, both. It depends. In addition to actually using these old machines to help you create music, which can add a unique bit of charm to your work, I think they are also super relevant to modern music as a tool of comparison. I think that a little bit like camping, I find that I'll leave town to go camping and step out on the trail and think to myself, this is amazing. Why do we spend so much time indoors? Then throughout the trip, I'll think things like, why do we even live in houses, man? Everything you need is right here. Then a few days later, when I take my first hot shower and climb into my nice comfy bed in my quiet room, I find myself thinking things like, why would anyone ever leave this place? So similarly, I find that regular treks into the workflows of days gone by can help bring perspective about the modern amenities of the latest and greatest. I find little nooks and crannies within the design assumptions of these older machines that offer some new insight into my workflow. And I can carry that lesson back and apply it in my modern workflow. But just like camping or backpacking, it's easy to idolize a return to a simpler existence, when in practice, most of us would have a very hard time forsaking all modern amenities. I know I would. So I propose a hybrid approach. Let's not worry about whether retro gear is better than modern gear in every case. Just every now and then make a retreat from your modern tech and go try out some older tools, borrow something from a friend, and you might be surprised of some of the souvenirs that you bring back. So I hope you enjoyed this series. I certainly really enjoyed exploring these devices and spending some time thinking about how electronic instruments and composition tools manifest in different eras of technology. Thanks again so much to Yamaha for giving me this project and trusting me with these beautiful machines. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section, wherever that might be. And if you like this and want to subscribe to it, please click the appropriate buttons at your earliest convenience. Thanks, and I'll see y'all next time.